Look, ma'am, I appreciate you signing up today. I really do. But the long-range stations are for people who've trained recently. We don't need an injury on the line, and frankly, we don't need the paperwork. The short-distance lane is right over there. You'll be comfortable. You'll be safe. He said the word safe the way certain men say it to certain women. Not with concern, with a lid. A polite, padded lid pressed firmly down over something he didn't want to deal with. She looked at him for a moment. Just a moment. Then she nodded once, picked up her range bag, and walked to the short-distance lane without a word. The range sergeant, Staff Sergeant Decker, watched her go with the mild satisfaction of a man who had managed a small problem before it became a larger one. He smoothed the front of his uniform, turned back to his roster, and moved on. He had no idea what he had just done. He had no idea who was standing 60 feet away, setting her coffee cup on a wooden shelf and unpacking her bag with the quiet, methodical efficiency of someone who had done exactly this, in conditions he could not begin to imagine, more times than he had years in uniform. He had no idea that the standard he had been teaching every new shooter for the past 10 years, the Iron Sights qualification protocol that his own instructors had handed him as gospel, had been written by the woman he had just sent to the beginner lane. He was about to find out. Her name was Eleanor Marsh. Most people who knew her, the ones who really knew her, called her something else. But that name, that other name, the one spoken in certain briefing rooms in certain years, was not a name she advertised. It lived in files that carried classification levels the staff sergeant had never held. It lived in the memory of men who had served beside her, and who, when they heard it spoken aloud, went very quiet, very fast, with the particular stillness of people recalling something enormous. At 63, Eleanor Marsh looked like exactly what she appeared to be. A civilian woman with sensible boots, a gray fleece jacket, and a slight hitch in her left hip that she had carried since 2004. She was of medium height, medium build, with close-cropped silver hair and eyes the color of weathered slate. There was nothing flashy about her, nothing that would catch your attention in a grocery store or a parking lot or a clinic waiting room. That invisibility was, in its way, the most dangerous thing about her. She had cultivated it for 11 years in the field and had never entirely let it go, even after. It had become less a tactic and more a posture, a way of moving through a world that no longer demanded lethal precision from her, but that she observed with the same patient, measuring attention regardless. Old habits, they say, die hard. In Eleanor Marsh's case, they had not died at all. They had simply gone quiet. The Wounded Warrior Marksmanship Clinic had been set up at the Army Reserve Center's firing range on a cool Tuesday in October. The parking lot held a modest scatter of personal vehicles and one government van that had brought several of the recovering veterans from the nearby medical facility. There were 17 participants in total, men and women ranging from their late 20s to their mid-40s, most of them showing the physical signatures of recent trauma, a sling here, a prosthetic there, the careful gait of someone still negotiating terms with their own body. Eleanor was the oldest by more than 15 years. She had signed up quietly through the standard registration portal, with no fanfare and no special notation in her paperwork beyond the standard liability waiver and the medical clearance form. She had listed her service history in the box that asked for it, but the box was small and the staff sergeant, processing registrations, had not looked closely. He had seen, veteran, female, age 63, hip injury noted. He had drawn his conclusions and moved on. His conclusions were wrong. Sergeant First Class Raymond Decker had been running firing range operations for 6 years. Before that, he had been an infantry small arms instructor, a job he had been good at and proud of. He knew weapons, He knew procedure. He knew, with the bone-deep certainty of a man who had never been seriously challenged in his domain, how to read a shooter before they ever touched a rifle. He read them by their hands, by the way they stood near the bench, by whether they checked the chamber as a habit or as a remembered instruction, by the angle of their shoulders when they first looked down range. He had looked at Eleanor Marsh and seen a liability. He had seen the hip, the age, the civilian clothes. He had seen the way she carried her range bag, not with the aggressive ease of someone who hauled gear for a living, but with the practiced efficiency of someone who had learned long ago to make everything look like it cost less effort than it did. He had registered that as the movement of an older woman being careful with herself. He had missed the part where careful and cautious are entirely different things. At the short-distance lane, Eleanor chambered her assigned rifle, a standard-issue M16A2, ran a function check with the automatic fluency of someone for whom the action lived below the level of conscious thought, and settled in. The short lane ran to 50 meters. She shot it clean, 3-round groups tight enough to cover with a quarter, and then she set the rifle down and picked up her coffee. She wasn't bored. She wasn't frustrated. She was waiting. She didn't know yet what she was waiting for. She never did in those days. She just kept her attention open, the way she had learned to keep it open in places where closing it down to a single focus got people killed. And she drank her coffee, and she watched the range. The guest instructor, Sergeant Major Vincent Carver, arrived at 9:45. He came in a government sedan, no escort, no ceremony, wearing his service uniform with the kind of unself-conscious correctness that comes from decades of putting it on. He was 51, broad through the chest, with a face that had been worked over by weather and stress into something angular and permanent. He had done 3 tours in Afghanistan, 2 in Iraq, 1 in a location he still could not name in public, and he had, over the course of 28 years in the Army, become one of the most respected long-range marksmanship instructors the service had produced. He was here because wounded warriors got the best. He shook hands with the range cadre, signed the appropriate forms, and walked the line to meet the participants. He moved the way experienced senior NCOs always moved, unhurried but purposeful, wasting nothing. He paused at each station, asked a question or two, watched how the shooters handled their weapons, and responded to small corrections. He paused a beat longer at the short lane. He watched Eleanor Marsh shoot her second 3-round group. He watched the groups. He watched the way she tracked back to her natural point of aim between strings without adjusting her position, the way her trigger press was so smooth and consistent that the rifle barely moved. He said nothing. He moved on. But Sergeant Major Carver made a note. He filed it in the kind of mental drawer that experienced men of his type keep. The drawer labeled things that don't fit, things to check later, anomalies in an otherwise ordinary Tuesday. If you believe that the most dangerous person in any room is the one who has nothing left to prove, type competence in the comments below. Because in about 30 minutes, this range was going to learn something it would not forget. The clinic moved through its morning schedule with the organized efficiency of a military training event. Safety brief, zeroing, basic form review, then a progression to longer distances for those the cadre assessed as ready. Eleanor remained at her short lane. No one came to reassess her. Staff Sergeant Decker was occupied at the 400-meter stations, coaching 2 younger veterans through their prone position, and he had, in his mental filing system, placed Eleanor Marsh in the resolved column. She drank her second cup of coffee. At 10:38, Sergeant Major Carver moved to the 900-meter position. 900 meters is a distance that filters out almost everyone who has not trained specifically for it. It is the distance at which the human eye, without magnification, is making decisions based on dots rather than shapes. It is the distance at which wind, which is invisible, becomes the primary variable, and where reading that variable correctly is the difference between a hit and a miss by 3 feet. At 900 meters, a trained shooter with a quality optic and ideal conditions can expect to work for a group. An untrained shooter at 900 meters is conducting ballistic experimentation. Sergeant Major Carver set up at the position with his personal rifle, a precision bolt action with a high-quality variable scope, and ran through his wind-reading routine. He was going to demonstrate a 5-round group at distance for the clinic participants who had gathered at the observation point to watch. He settled into position. He reached for the scope's adjustment turret. He turned it again. He brought his eye to the optic and looked through it. The reticle was gone. Not blurry, not misaligned. Gone, as in the internal illumination had failed entirely, and a crack, invisible from the exterior, had apparently run through the glass at some point during transport, leaving him with a tube of metal that showed him the color of the lens and nothing else. He pulled back from the rifle, checked the turret, checked the battery compartment, and ran a short, silent inventory of the situation. He had a rifle. He had a target at 900 meters. He did not have a functional optic. He looked at the participants assembled at the observation point. "Does anyone here have iron sight experience at distance?" he asked. Not announcing the problem, just asking the question. "I need a volunteer to demonstrate a cold-bore string at 900 meters, iron sights only." Silence. Not the silence of reluctance, not quite. The silence of honest self-assessment. Iron sights at 900 meters is not a thing most people can do. It is not a thing most trained shooters can do without specific practice. The veterans on the line that day were good people. Many of them were capable marksmen, but 900 meters with iron sights is a specialist skill, and none of them were going to raise their hand and miss in front of a sergeant major. 17 people said nothing. And then, from the short distance lane, a voice said, "If I could borrow the rifle." It was not loud, it was not a question, quite, and it was not quite a statement. It was the kind of sentence that people with complete situational confidence produce. Simple, clean, containing neither apology nor demand. Staff Sergeant Decker, who had come back to the main line to observe the demonstration, turned toward the voice with the particular expression of a man who knows, already, that he is not going to like what comes next. Eleanor Marsh had set her coffee down. She was walking toward the 900-meter position with the unhurried gait of someone who knew exactly where they were going and why. "Ma'am," Decker said, stepping forward, his voice carrying the automatic authority of a man used to having it respected. "This station is outside the parameters we established for your lane assignment. I'm going to need you to return to—" She did not look at him. She did not look at him the way a person ignores someone they haven't heard. She did not look at him the way a person is being rude. She did not look at him with any particular intention at all. She simply had a destination, and she was moving toward it, and the staff sergeant's voice registered as background sound the way the wind off the grass registered. Information to be processed and filed at its appropriate priority level. Its appropriate priority level, apparently, was low. Sergeant Major Carver watched this. He watched Eleanor Marsh cross the firing line and stand at his position. He watched her look at the rifle for a moment, then pick it up with the single-handed ease of someone for whom the weight was entirely familiar. He watched her run a function check without being asked to. He watched her look downrange. He stepped back, not aside, back. The instinctive movement of a man making room for something he recognizes. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "the target is at 900 meters. Wind is coming left, at approximately 8 to 10 miles per hour. Variable. Temperature is 54 degrees. Pressure is... I see it, she said. She was looking at the grass between the firing point and the target berm, specifically at the grass in the middle distance, at the bend and recovery of the taller stalks, the differential between the movement near the ground and the movement at head height. She was doing this without a wind meter, without a calculator, without anything except her eyes and a mental process that she had refined across 11 years and more shooting positions than she had ever formally counted. Decker took another step toward her. "Sergeant Major, with respect, this participant has been assigned to the short sergeant," Carver said, without looking at him. "One word." The staff sergeant stopped. Eleanor Marsh shouldered the rifle. She had not fired iron sights at 900 meters in a long time. If you had asked her how long, she would have thought about it and said something like, "In an actual field application. Probably 2013. But the body does not experience skill the way the calendar experiences time. The body keeps what it has been given, in the deep, layered memory of 10,000 repetitions, and it produces that memory when called, if the mind gets out of the way. Eleanor Marsh's mind was very good at getting out of the way. She brought the rear aperture to her eye. She found the front sight post. She looked through the aperture, past the post, to the target at 900 meters. At this distance, with iron sights, the front sight post covered a significant portion of the target, and the instinct of untrained shooters was to focus on the post rather than on where the post needed to go. Eleanor did not focus on the post. She had not focused on the post since the early months of her first deployment, when a patient, weathered warrant officer with a gift for teaching, had explained to her that the front sight is not the destination, it is the instrument, and the destination is the gap between where the round will go and where the target will be when it arrives. She breathed in, she breathed out. She accounted for the wind, not with a formal calculation, not with numbers consciously processed, but with the integrated judgment of someone who had done this with actual stakes, with a result that mattered in a way she would not describe in present company. The wind was 8 to 9, left to right, with a slight gust cycle of about 4 seconds. She had watched 3 cycles while Decker was talking. She knew where the gust would be in the trigger press. She accounted for temperature and altitude with the automatic fluency of someone for whom these corrections long ago stopped requiring thought. She placed the sight where it needed to be. She pressed the trigger. The rifle moved. She tracked back through the recoil, returned to her natural point of aim without adjusting her grip, and fired a second round. Then a third. 3 rounds, 5 seconds, total, from the moment the rifle came up. She set it down on the bench and stepped back and picked up her coffee. There was a spotting scope on the bench beside the position. Sergeant Major Carver had put it there before his optic failed. He had set it on the target, and now he leaned to it and looked. He was quiet for a moment. 3 rounds, he said, to no one in particular. Inside the 10 ring. He said it the way you say something that you are still processing, not announcing a result, recalibrating. Behind him, 17 veterans who had been holding a collective breath let it out in various quiet ways. A murmur moved through the group. Someone said something low and impressed. Someone else said nothing at all but looked at the woman who had just put 3 rounds through an iron-sighted rifle into a circle at 900 meters in the time it had taken most of them to think about trying. Staff Sergeant Decker stood at the edge of the position. His clipboard was in his hand. He had not lowered it from the position he had raised it to when he started to object. He had not moved in 5 seconds. He was looking at Eleanor Marsh with an expression he would have been unable to name if asked. Sergeant Major Carver straightened from the spotting scope. He looked at Eleanor Marsh for a moment. Then he walked to the bench where she had set the rifle down. He picked it up and turned it over. He looked at the underside of the stock, and he went very still. If you have been supporting Old Bill's Tales and you'd like to keep these stories coming, there's a Patreon link in the description below. Every bit of support helps keep the channel going, and I'm grateful for every one of you. Cut into the wood of the stock, in fine, even strokes, was a column of marks, small, precise, arranged with a craftsman's care. They were not scratches, they were deliberate. Each one was clean and measured. They ran the length of the lower stock in a column of 11 years, and at the bottom of the column was a unit code and a date range that began in 2002 and ended in 2013, and a number that Sergeant Major Carver had not expected to see here, on this day, in this place, on a rifle that belonged to the Range Armory and had clearly not been in Eleanor Marsh's possession in some time. 119 marks. He set the rifle down with the care of someone handling something they have suddenly recognized as irreplaceable. He straightened. He turned to face the woman standing with her coffee cup. He called her by a name that was not Eleanor Marsh. He used a call sign. 2 syllables. Nothing dramatic in the syllables themselves, but the way he said them, with the particular tone of a man who has just found something he thought was history, produced an effect on the gathered group that no one had anticipated. The murmurs stopped. The movement stopped. 17 veterans, who had been quietly watching a demonstration, became very still. Staff Sergeant Decker looked at his sergeant major. He looked at the woman. He looked at the stock of the rifle on the bench, and though he was too far away to read the marks, he could see what they were, could count the rough density of them from where he stood, and his clipboard came down to his side very slowly. Sergeant Major Carver said, in a voice that carried the length of the range without being raised, Sergeant Major Eleanor Marsh, retired, Special Forces Support Command, assigned to elements I am not going to name in this setting. 11 years of active field deployment. Deployments to Afghanistan, Iraq, and 3 other locations that don't appear on unclassified paperwork. He paused. Author, he said, of the Iron Sights qualification standard currently used across every infantry and special operations marksmanship program in the United States Army. He let that settle. The standard, he continued, without inflection, but with the weight of a man choosing each word precisely, that has been taught at this range, by this cadre, for the past decade. The silence that followed was of a specific and particular kind. It was the silence of people doing arithmetic, of people placing, suddenly, a thing they have known in the category of things they have not understood. The Iron Sights standard was not new to anyone on the line. It was the architecture of their training, the framework they had absorbed, the baseline they had worked from as shooters. They had been taught it the way people are taught foundational things, as given, as settled, as the product of some distant and impersonal expertise. The expertise was standing 20 feet away drinking coffee. Staff Sergeant Decker heard his sergeant major say the words, "wrote the standard." He heard them. They arrived in his understanding in the way that very large things sometimes arrive, slowly, with a kind of geological heaviness, settling layer by layer into the ground of what he knew, and reorganizing it from underneath. He heard the words, and he understood them individually, and he understood them in sequence, and then he understood them together, as a complete and terrible sentence, and what he felt was not embarrassment, though that was there, and it was not shame, though that was there too, and it was not anger, because there was nothing to be angry at, and it was not surprise, because some part of him, some small, quiet part that he had not listened to this morning, had seen something in Eleanor Marsh's eyes and had filed it in the wrong drawer. What he felt, most precisely, was the particular vertigo of a man who has been confident in the wrong direction. She had stood at his short lane for 30 minutes. She had shot her 50-meter groups and drunk her coffee and said nothing and waited. And she had done all of it with the patient equanimity of a woman who had, on balance, stood in worse places under worse conditions and had found that equanimity was simply more useful than the alternatives. She had not complained. She had not said, "Do you know who I am?" She had not produced credentials, or signaled rank, or done any of the things that smaller people in her position might have done, might have been forgiven for doing. She had picked up her bag and walked to the short lane and shot clean groups and drunk her coffee, and when the moment arrived that required what she actually had, she had produced it, and then she had put it away again and picked up her coffee. Sergeant Major Carver had turned to face the group now. He had his hands at his sides. His posture was not formal, it was not theatrical, it was simply the posture of a man who is saying something that matters. Sergeant Major Marsh set the 900-meter iron sights accuracy record for the Special Operations community in 2009, he said. That record stands. She wrote the qualification standard in 2011 after her third combat deployment, in response to optic failures in field conditions, specifically because she had been in exactly this situation, without a working optic, at distance, with a target that was not a paper circle. He did not say what that target had been. He did not need to. The room understood that the marks on the underside of the stock were not a hobby. They were a record. A professional record of the most demanding kind, kept in the most private place available, in the way that people who do what Eleanor Marsh had done keep records, not for an audience, not for a file, not for anything but the private accounting of a life's serious work. 119, 11 years. A date range that began when several of the men and women on the line had been in high school. Sergeant Major Carver took 3 steps forward and stopped in front of Eleanor Marsh. He came to attention. He rendered a salute with the precision of someone for whom this gesture was not ceremony, but statement. She received it and returned it, and the two of them stood for a moment in a formality that was also, somehow, recognition of what the work was, of what it cost, of what it meant to have done it without an audience and without complaint, and to be standing here now, at 63, in civilian clothes at a clinic for people decades her junior, still perfectly capable of the thing that had defined 11 years of her life. "Ma'am," Carver said, coming out of the salute, "would you be willing to take the long-range station for the rest of the morning?" She looked at him. A trace of something moved across her face, not quite a smile. Something quieter than a smile, and older. "I'd need another coffee," she said. Someone in the group laughed. It was the released, slightly unsteady laugh of people who have been holding their breath. And then the group started to move, shifting toward the long-range stations, falling into a new formation, a new orientation around a new center of gravity, and the center of gravity was a 63-year-old woman with a coffee cup and a slight hitch in her left hip, and 119 marks under a stock she had never owned. Staff Sergeant Decker was still standing at the short-distance lane. He was looking at the 50-meter target, at the 3-round groups Eleanor Marsh had put into it during the 30 minutes she'd been assigned to the beginner station. They were, he could see from here, tighter than anything he had produced himself this year. He held his clipboard. He did not know what to do with it. The clinic continued for another 3 hours. Eleanor Marsh shot the 900-meter line for the rest of the morning, and then she shot the 1,000-meter line when someone set it up on Carver's request, and then she stood behind the recovering veterans one at a time and told them what she saw in their technique, and what she would change, and why. And she did it in the unhurried, precise language of someone who has taught this before, in settings where the correction needed to be delivered once and retained forever. The veterans listened, the way people listen to someone who has made the cost of error real. Sergeant Major Carver shot beside her for a portion of the morning, and the two of them moved through the long-range positions with the comfortable parallel attention of professionals, not performing for each other, not competing, simply working through the distance together, the way people who speak the same language speak it when there is no need to explain. He had known her name for years. He had not known her face. She had operated as the people in her particular community operated, below the level at which faces become public information. Her name appeared in the marksmanship community in the way certain foundational things appeared, as a source, as a standard, as the origin point of a practice that had propagated forward through time into the daily training of thousands of soldiers who had no idea where it had come from or who had made it. She had not minded that. She had, in fact, preferred it. Eleanor Marsh had come to understand, across 11 years of doing the work and several more of watching other people do it, that the desire to be known for a thing was inversely related to the ability to do the thing without distraction. The operators she had trusted most, in the hardest places, had been the ones who were least interested in having their competence recognized and most interested in exercising it correctly. The ones who needed the recognition had always been, in her experience, the ones whose competence needed the most supplement. She did not need the recognition. She was here because the clinic had needed participants, and because she had maintained her fitness and her fundamentals and saw no reason to stop, and because a part of her, the quiet, unsentimental, practical part that had never fully come home from the work, had looked at the registration form and thought, they might need someone who can shoot. She had been right. She was usually right, not through any mystical intuition, but through the accumulated precision of 11 years of getting it wrong and correcting and refining, of being in situations where wrong carried consequences too large to revisit, of having learned the difference between confidence and accuracy, and having, at considerable cost, chosen accuracy every time. Staff Sergeant Decker spent the 3 hours of the clinic's continuation in a state that could be described, charitably, as recalibration. He ran his stations. He coached his participants. He fulfilled his role with the mechanical competence of someone operating below conscious engagement. But he was thinking, continuously and without much relief, about the morning, about the short-distance lane and the way he had said, "You'll be comfortable," and the way she had nodded and picked up her bag and walked away from him as if his authority were simply a piece of furniture to navigate around. He was thinking about the word safe. He had said she would be safe at the short lane, and what he had meant, though he had not known he meant it, was that he would be safe with her at the short lane, safe from the complication of a participant who moved in ways he hadn't predicted, safe from whatever she was that his first reading hadn't accounted for. He had made her small to make his morning manageable, and she had let him. She had walked to the short lane and shot clean groups and drunk her coffee and let him have his manageable morning right up until the moment when the morning required something he didn't have, and then she had provided it, not to correct him, not to embarrass him, but because the moment required it, and she was the one who could. That was the part he kept returning to. She had not done it to him. She had done it for the clinic. He was realizing, a very small figure in a story that was not about him at all. It is an uncomfortable thing to realize. Most people go some lengths to avoid it. Decker, to his credit, did not look away from it. He sat with it through the afternoon and let it do its work. At the end of the clinic, he walked to the long-range station where Eleanor Marsh was packing her range bag. He stopped in front of her. He was holding his clipboard. He looked at it for a moment, as though he might find something useful written on it, and then he set it down on the bench. "Ma'am," he said. She looked at him with those slate-gray eyes that neither condemned nor absolved. She waited. "I made a decision this morning without sufficient information," he said. He was not reading from a script. He was not performing a rehearsed apology. He was saying the only true thing he had found to say. "I assigned you to the short lane based on an assessment that was incomplete. That was an error in my judgment, and it affected your clinic experience, and I'd like to correct the record." She studied him for a moment. She had a specific, practiced ability to read the difference between an apology that was about the person giving it and an apology that was about the truth. She had seen a lot of both. This one, she judged, was about the truth. "Noted," she said, and corrected. She picked up her range bag and her coffee cup, which was empty. "You teach the standard well," she said. "I've read the feedback reports. The fundamentals you're getting into them are sound." It was not a consolation prize. She was not softening a lesson. She had, evidently, actually read the feedback reports, from whatever vantage point allowed her access to them, and had formed an actual assessment. Decker heard it as what it was, a professional evaluation from a professional whose evaluation meant something. He straightened slightly, without meaning to. "Thank you, ma'am." She nodded once and walked toward the parking lot with the unhurried, slightly uneven gait of a woman with an old hip wound that she had carried for 20 years without complaint and would carry for whatever years remained without complaint, because it was hers, and because she did not waste time on things that could not be changed. Sergeant Major Carver watched her go. He stood at the long-range position with his hands in his pockets and watched until she reached the parking lot and got into a sensible mid-sized sedan and drove away. He had known her name for years. He was going to know her face now. He thought that was probably as it should be. The story did not stay at the range. These things never do. By the following week, it had moved through the network of people who had been present that day, carried in the particular informal current that military communities use to pass the things that matter, the things that do not appear in official reports, but that shape the culture of a place more permanently than any official report ever does. It moved in mess halls and motor pools and in the low, comfortable conversation of people who have worked together long enough to speak in shorthand. The version that traveled was not the full version. It was the essential version, compressed to its elements, the way stories compress when they move through time and distance. A sergeant major, retired. A range clinic. A sergeant who sent her to the beginner lane. A broken optic. 900 meters, 3 rounds, inside the 10 ring, and then the stock. The stock always appeared in the telling. The 119 marks, the unit code, the date range. They had become the story's center of gravity, the thing that carried the weight of 11 years in the way that a single image can carry what 100 pages might otherwise take to say. New shooters at that range, in the weeks and months after, heard the story before they had been there long enough to know the place. They heard it the way you hear a story that a place tells about itself, one that has become part of the building's character, inseparable from the lanes and the bench and the 900-meter berm. Some of them asked about the short-distance lane and why it was marked differently now, with a small laminated card on the bench that had not been there before. The card said, "All participants will be assessed at distance before lane assignment." It was unsigned. It did not explain itself. The veterans who had been at the clinic that morning, the ones who had watched Eleanor Marsh pick up the rifle and shoulder it and press the trigger and step back, did not tell the story the way the mess hall told it. They told it more quietly and less often, and with a specificity that no second-hand account could reproduce. They told it with the knowledge of what the stillness had looked like from 20 feet away. The complete absence of performance in every movement she made. The way she had not looked at Decker when he tried to stop her, not as a dismissal, but as a simple alignment of attention. Her attention was downrange, and that was where it needed to be, and that was where it went. They told it as a lesson in priorities. One of the veterans, a young woman named Corporal Brianna Watts, had come to the clinic as a participant with a shoulder injury that was still limiting her range of motion. She had been assigned to a modified station and had spent most of the morning working within her constraints, patient and focused, making what progress she could. She had watched the entire Eleanor Marsh sequence from 20 feet and had said nothing, in the moment or after, to any of the others. But she had gone back to the range on her own time 6 weeks later. She had signed up for the next clinic. She had worked through the assessment. She had qualified for the 400-meter station. When someone asked her what had changed, she said she had stopped spending energy on the wrong things. She meant the energy she had been spending on being the injured veteran at the modified station, the energy of self-classification and self-limitation, and the subtle accommodation of other people's categories. She had watched Eleanor Marsh decline to spend that energy, had watched her nod once and pick up her bag and go shoot clean groups, and drink her coffee, and wait until the moment required what she had, and then produce it without announcement, and it had done something to Brianna Watts's understanding of what being constrained actually meant. It meant Eleanor Marsh's example had shown her almost nothing. It meant almost nothing at all. This was the lesson the story carried, in its various forms and compressions and retellings. Not about women in the military, though it was that too. Not about age, though it was that too. Not about the specific case of Eleanor Marsh, whose specific case was too singular to generalize directly. It was about the architecture of assumptions, about the way that assumptions are, in the technical military sense, a failure mode. A gap in intelligence, a decision made without sufficient information that leaves you exposed to conditions you have not prepared for. Staff Sergeant Decker had made a tactical error of the most fundamental kind. He had believed that his first reading was complete, that what was visible on the surface was the whole inventory of what was present, that the clipboard and the lane assignment and the category of 63-year-old woman with a hip injury were adequate tools for the situation. They were not adequate tools. They had never been adequate tools. The situation had always contained what it contained, and his tools had simply failed to detect it. This was not a problem unique to Staff Sergeant Decker. It is, in fact, the most common problem in any environment that requires human beings to make rapid assessments of other human beings. We see what we have been taught to see. We reach for the category that fits most of what is visible and apply it as though it captures all of what is present. And then the situation produces its reality, and the category is found wanting, and we are left, like Decker with his clipboard, in the particular vertigo of having been confident in the wrong direction. The corrective is not complicated. It is simply harder than the assumption. The corrective is to hold the category loosely, to apply it as provisional rather than definitive. To remember that every human being in every room contains a history that the room cannot see, a set of competencies and experiences and choices accumulated across decades, and that the surface is not the inventory, the surface is the cover, and the cover tells you very little about the book. Eleanor Marsh knew this better than most, because she had spent 11 years being the book that its cover did not describe. She had spent 11 years operating in environments where visibility was a liability, where being seen accurately was dangerous, where the gap between what she appeared to be and what she actually was had been, in the most precise sense, a professional asset. She had learned to carry that gap quietly, to maintain it without resentment or performance, to let other people's assumptions do their work, and save her energy for the moment. The moment required something real. She had been doing it so long that she had stopped noticing she was doing it. The morning at the range had been no different from any other morning in that sense. She had assessed the situation, identified the appropriate lane, walked to it, and waited. She had not been hurt by Decker's dismissal because she had not been surprised by it, and she had not been surprised by it because she had been dismissed in more consequential circumstances by more consequential people, and the dismissal had never yet altered the reality of what she was or what she was capable of. Assumptions, she had learned, were other people's problem. Her job had always been to be ready when the moment arrived. The moment always arrived. There is a particular kind of person who does the hardest work in any field, any institution, any community. They are not usually the loudest people in the room. They are not usually the people with the most visible credentials or the most aggressively maintained reputation. They are the people who have, at some point, made the decision to let the work speak and to keep the rest quiet, because the work is the point, and the noise around the work is a distraction from it. These people are, in every environment, the most dangerous people to underestimate. Not dangerous in the way that provokes fear, dangerous in the way that produces consequence. Dangerous in the way that a broken optic at 900 meters produces consequence. Suddenly, specifically, at the moment when something matters, when the situation requires what only a certain kind of preparation can provide, and the loudest people in the room discover that preparation is not the same as performance, and that confidence is not the same as competence, and that the short lane is sometimes occupied by the person who wrote the test. Eleanor Marsh drove home that afternoon and made lunch and read for a while and took her dog for a slow walk in the October air, moving with the careful, unhurried pace of a woman who has been moving carefully for 20 years and has long since made her peace with it. She did not think extensively about the morning. She had thought about it on the drive home, turned it over once or twice in the practical way she turned most things over, and had filed it in the category of days that contained something unexpected and had resolved cleanly. She thought, briefly, about Decker, about the look on his face when Carver had said, "Wrote the standard." She held it without judgment, because judgment required energy she had long ago reallocated. He had done what most people did with incomplete information. He had been wrong in a specific and correctable direction. He had, when given the opportunity, taken the correction with more grace than she had expected. That was something, she thought more briefly, about the marks on the stock of that range rifle, the marks that were not her marks, that bore her unit code and her date range and her number as though someone had copied them there, or as though the rifle had found its way to her in a way she had not tracked. She had said nothing about that in the moment. She had said nothing about a great many things, across a great many moments. It was enough that they were there. It was enough that the record existed, somewhere, in the fine, even strokes of a practice she had kept across 11 years, in wood and memory, and the standards that were still being taught, and the qualification that still bore her mathematics, and the shooters who were still being shaped by a decision she had made in 2011 in a quiet office after a deployment that had made the case for iron sights, definitively, at 900 meters. The work persisted. The work always persisted. That was enough. It had always been enough. And somewhere, at a range that was settling into its afternoon quiet, a laminated card on a short-distance bench said, "All participants will be assessed at distance before lane assignment." And the card did not say who had prompted it, or why, or what had happened on a Tuesday in October to make it necessary. It did not need to say. The most important lessons rarely announce their origin. They simply appear, in the right places, at the right times, and do their work quietly, the way the best people always have. For more stories where quiet competence humbles loud arrogance, you're in the right place. Subscribe to Old Bill's Tales and stay with me. And if you'd like to help keep these stories coming, you'll find my Patreon linked in the description below. I'm grateful for every one of you who believes these stories deserve to be told. Old Bill, out.